The fight, Hagler versus Hearns, Caesar's Palace, 15th of April 1985. Oh, them were the days. Nearly a quarter century later, the 1985 fight between Hagler and Hearns remained a high point of boxing in the latter half of the 20th century. Knowledgeable experts have described it as the greatest short fight in boxing history. Its ferocious first round, which to this day remains the standard amongst which all others are measured, was undoubtedly the most exciting in middleweight annals and one of the 2 or 3 best opening stanzas of all time. In an age where it had already become obligatory to sell every big fight with a catchy slogan, Arum christened the matchup between Hagler and Hearns as simply The Fight. Although its official build-up consumed several months, beginning in late 1984, the fight had been at least 3 years in the making in 1982, with Ray Leonard heading towards retirement and Roberto Duran still tainted by the disgrace of his no-mask performance in New Orleans. Hagler and Hearns were 2 premier boxers in the game, and a showdown seemed inevitable. In early 1982, Arum, Hagler's lawyer Steve Wainwright, and Emanuel Stewart had entered into a unique free-fight contract pitting Hagler against a trio of middleweights from Stewart's Kronk Gym. Under the terms of the arrangement, the middleweight champion would fight in order Mickey Goodwin, William Caveman Lee, and in the grand finale of the trilogy, Thomas the Hitman Hearns. The Goodwin bout was to have taken place in March in Italy, with Rodolfo Sabatini co-promoter, but Goodwin broke his hand in training. Caveman Lee considered a less worthy challenger, who rushed into the breach, and the fight was moved from San Remo to Atlantic City, where Hagler required barely a minute to send Lee back to his cave. With Goodwin still indisposed, the decision was taken to go straight to the Hearns fight, which was scheduled for the 24th of May, 1982, in Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit. The posters were printed, as were tickets, but the fight did not happen. The unraveling of the Windsor fight remains shrouded in mystery. The only way to make the fight was to sell it on closed circuit, but HBO, which had a multi-fight contract with Hagler through Top Rank, believed it had the right of first refusal and filed for an injunction. In what seemed a transparent attempt to stage an end run around HBO, the Windsor card was to be promoted not by Top Rank but by Bob Arum Enterprises. In the past, the corporate name had been used to promote Arum's South African ventures, presumably to shield Top Rank, had there been repercussions from anti-apartheid activists. I remember, Bob. I remember. The lawyers were poised to have a field day, but the billable hours were somewhat curtailed after it was reported that Hearns had conveniently broken the pinky finger on his right hand. A day after the injury to Hearns, a federal judge in Los Angeles ruled in HBO's favor, recalled Arum. We would have appealed if Tommy hadn't been hurt, but it would have been dragged on for some time and the fight would have been in jeopardy. Hagler versus Hearns was off, and in any case, it would not be revived for nearly 3 years. Hagler went to Italy later that year and disposed of Bob Arum's obligation to Sabatini and the unfortunate Fully Obligimus in the same evening. By the time they were scheduled to meet again, the price of poker had gone up. A guaranteed $10.5 million minimum now sat in the pot. The fight was announced in December 1984 at New York's Waldorf Astoria. Hagler and Hearns were all smiles, looking more like co-conspirators than adversaries, probably because they shared the knowledge that each would earn more than $5 million from their joint enterprise. In January and February, Hagler, Hearns, Arum embarked on what its participants would call the Magical Mystery Tour, designed to beat the drums for the closed-circuit sale. The itinerary called for the boxers to visit 22 cities in 2 weeks, both parties traveling in corporate jets. Caesars owned one of the planes, a state-of-the-art Gulfstream G2, with its own Pac-Man machine. Arum leased a second jet, a Falcon, which was slightly less luxurious and a bit slower. The plan called for Hagler to fly on the Gulfstream, where the parties were flying west. Once they reached Las Vegas, they would switch airplanes. But when we got to Vegas, Pat Petronelli called to tell me we had a problem, recalled Arum. Hagler said he was going home if he didn't get to stay on the G2. He refused to continue the tour if he had to fly on the Falcon. I tried to explain this to Emanuel Stewart, but then Tommy had a shit fit, said Arum. He said he was going home if he didn't get to fly in the Caesars plane. In the end, Aram had to turn the second plane in and lease another identical to the first, so that the boxers could have the separate but equal modes of transportation for the remainder of the tour. Neither man was exactly a polished public speaker, but Hearns, along with the rest of the Kronk boxing team, had been the beneficiary of locution lessons from Jackie Callan, who was basically Stewart's school mom in the Kronk gym. He would thoughtfully digest questions and then invariably begin with his answer, well, basically. So basically, Jackie got Stewart to make Tommy, every time you want to say motherfucker, stop yourself and say, well, basically. Hearns did his best to promote the fight, but every time he spoke, Hagler perceived what he was saying as disrespect, and by the end of the tour, he said, I might have had some respect for Tommy, but right now, I can't stand his ass. He's on an ego trip after knocking out Duran the way he did and watching me go the distance. And I'm going to do what I did to Alan Minter to him. Hearns and Hagler had also agreed to participate in the filming of the video for the band Van Sant's upcoming release, I'm a Fighter. Hagler, still battling the effects of a cold he had caught on the tour, telephoned his regrets on the morning of the photo shoot. Hearns was in Los Angeles, where he attended the Grammy Awards ceremonies and received his Fighter of the Year award at the WBC dinner. Unaware of Hagler's withdrawal, Hearns boarded a flight for New York, but the United 767 developed mechanical problems and had to return to the gate, where it remained for 2 hours. When it finally took off, one of the plane's 2 engines caught fire, forcing an emergency landing in Salt Lake City. It could have been, said Aram, the ultimate Sports Illustrated jinx. The magazine could wait, but in New York, Van Sant had leased Gleason's gym for the day. The band went ahead with the video, subbing with a pair of New York fighters, Kevin Moley and Albert Ramos. Footage that was shot of Hagler in Provincetown was later spliced in. Hearns intended to fly from New York to Europe to work with his Kronk teammate, Milton McCrory, who was defending his WBC welterweight title against Pedro Vieira in Paris. But Boxing Illustrated reported that Tommy is so shook up right now, he may never get on a plane again. They may have to move the fight to Salt Lake City. The initial plan was for Hagler to train in Provincetown, as he had for each of his previous 25 fights before moving to Palm Springs in mid-March. But the champion was nursing such a bad cold that Goody convinced him to proceed straight to the California desert, where the Americana Canyon Hotel had already offered the champion the run of the premises. In Palm Springs, Hagler sparred with Boogaloo Watts and Jerry Holly, both tall and rangy like Hearns. The Petronellis had also lined up Marcus Geraldo. Geraldo, tall, rough, rugged, had already fought Hagler, Leonard, and Hearns, taking both Hagler and Leonard the distance. But when Marcus failed to show up, he was replaced by Larry Davis, who didn't last long. Larry fell by the wayside after Marvin busted his eardrum with a left to the head in a sparring session. Boogaloo Watts, once ranked number 2 middleweight in the world, had been the first man to defeat Hagler, whom he had captured a hometown majority decision in Philadelphia 9 years earlier. The controversial loss had been subsequently avenged, and Watts eventually emerged as a loyal and respected member of the Hagler camp. 2 years earlier, he, along with fellow Philadelphian Buster Drayton, had traveled to Italy to spar with Hagler before Oblajamas 2 in San Remo. Bobby might have been a champion himself if I hadn't been there, said Hagler of Watts. He's smart, he knows who I'm fighting. He'll lay against the ropes, throw overhand rights and hooks to the body, fight in spurts, do all the things that Hearns is likely to do. And the other kid, Holly, he's a younger, taller, bigger version of Hearns. Plus he's got something Tommy don't got. He's got guts. I don't think for a moment that Marvin actually believed that assessment of Hearns' mettle, but the events of April the 15th would surely prove him wrong. The challenge to Hagler had forced a radical departure from Hearns' traditional training modus operandi. Stewart's Kronk fighters normally sparred against one another without regard to weight class, and there was such an abundance of talent in the Detroit gym that they usually got all they wanted and more. You cannot get any better boxing than we give them in our own gym, but except for Milton McCrory, who can switch up, we just don't have any southpaws, said Kronk assistant Prentice Bird. Hearns trained at the Eden Rock in Miami Beach, where Emmanuel Stewart imported a trio of left-handers, middleweight Cecil Pettigrew of Tulsa, Brian Muller, Guyana, along with Kansas City light heavyweight Charles Henderson, to prep the hitman for the fight. Although Hearns had faced a few lefties in his amateur days, only one of his 41 professional opponents had been a southpaw, the immortal Sensak Moang Soring of Thailand. Moang Soring, said Bird, was a former world champion and all, but he still wasn't no Marvin Hagler. Hearns' crash course in how to fight southpaws also had to take into account the fact that Hagler, the best switch hitter since Mickey Mantle, could almost and certainly would switch over to orthodox at moments not even the champion could predict. It just kind of takes over, depending on how the fight is going, Hagler explained. I don't even think about it, it just happens. The likes of Kirk Douglas and Bob Hope enjoyed Hagler's company at the hotel, but despite being surrounded by celebrities, Hagler stated, "I'm not here to sign autographs or make appearances," he said. "In fact, I've heard people comment that I'm the hardest worker of any of the champions who've ever trained at this palace. This didn't just happen overnight, you know," he told me one day. "It took me a long time to gain this kind of prestige. I think back to years ago with me, Pat, and Goody sharing one $15 hotel room. This is the way it should be for a champion. It's finally happening to me. But yeah, I feel like it's something I've earned. I'm still me," he added. "I'm not ready to let all of this go." Hagler shared the training ring with Donald Curry, who would defend his WBA welterweight title against James Hardrock Green in Dallas 2 weeks before Hagler and Hearns. Mark Gastineau, the New York Jets sack specialist, has set up something called Mark Gastineau's Intensive Training Camp, at which he pumped iron for the edification of the hotel guests in another part of the tent. With the fight still nearly a month away, Hagler spent much of his time in seclusion thinking about Hearns. "Tommy is a dangerous opponent, and he's going to test me. But I know deep down in my soul that this man cannot whip me," said Hagler. Hagler attributed Hearns' self-assured demeanor to false courage. "The thing is, see, I've been shook up, but I've never been hurt. Tony Simpson shook me up with a left hook that I still remember. Even one Rodan hit me with a couple of good shots. But that's where the conditioning pays off. I've been able to absorb those kind of shots," reflected Hagler. "But Hearns has been stopped. Well, I've never been stopped. I know he can go, but he doesn't know if I can go." Hearns was attempting to become just the second 154-pound champion to win a 160-pound title. Nino Benvenuti had been the first, and going into the fight, the Hitman's credentials as a full-blown middleweight were regarded as questionable. Hearns had fought 5 times as a middleweight. 3 of his opponents, Mike Colbert, Ernie Singletary, and Murray Sutherland, had gone the distance, and Jeff McCracken had still been on his feet when his fight against Hearns was stopped in the 8th. Hearns had dispatched Marcus Giraldo, but it was so obvious the Mexican was in the tank. The knockout punch hit him in the shoulder, and even Emmanuel Stewart termed the fight an embarrassment. We were actually looking to get Tommy some work in that fight, but this guy had obviously decided that he didn't want no part of that. Hearns was known for his punch power as a welterweight, but the jury was still out if the power would carry up into the heavier weights. Mike Katz had gone to Miami Beach to watch Hearns train for the Hagler fight one day while Emmanuel Stewart was off preparing something for Tommy to eat. "We discussed the upcoming fight," said Katz. "I reminded him that in every other fight there's a boxer and there's a puncher, and asked him which one he would be in this one. Tommy, of course, said I'm the boxer, but if I hurt him, I'm going for the knockout." That's when it occurred to me that the conventional wisdom Hagler late was probably wrong. Of course Tommy was going to hurt him. He was faster, and he hit like a mule. But I also figured he couldn't really hurt Hagler, and that by going for an early knockout, he might put himself within Hagler's reach and in harm's way. When Hagler decided to fight the 15-round distance against Mustafa Hamsho, the WBC stripped him of his middleweight title in 1984. Hagler took the issue to court, where a federal judge once again ordered Jose Sulaiman to restore his championship. Going into this fight, Sulaiman opted for a new tactic. He turned the thumbscrews on Hearns, threatening to strip him of the 154-pound title he had held since 1982, when he captured a majority decision over Benitez in New Orleans. Officially, the WBC position was that Hearns couldn't fight Hagler without facing top-rated challenger John the Beast Mugabe. Unofficially, Los Bandidos, that's what the book's written down. I think that could be another word for sanctioning body or WBC. Let it be known that Hearns would be granted dispensation on the matter, provided Hagler Hearns was scheduled for 12 and not 15, while publicly expressing his respect for the traditional 15-round distance in this instance. Stewart actually preferred the shorter limit, which he figured would be in his man's advantage. The WBC decision to lean on Hearns in any case produced its desired effect. Rather than face yet another delay, the champions' camp reluctantly conceded on this issue, and the Hearns fight became just the second of Marvin Hagler's middleweight championship reign to be scheduled for 12. The original panel of judges agreed upon by the WBC and the Nevada State Athletic Commission had consisted of Reno's Herb Santos, England's Harry Gibbs, and Rudy Ortega of Los Angeles. Pascal Petronelli vociferously objected to Ortega, who claimed Hagler's co-handler might be disposed to favor Hearns. For the record, the objection rested on the grounds that Ortega's big fight experience had been primarily as a referee, not a judge. Privately, Ortega's cozy relationship with the WBC and its president worried the Hagler camp as well as his promoter. "I don't want to see them try steal it from Marvin," said Aram. "It's no secret that Jose Suleiman and Emmanuel Stewart are like cousins," added Petronelli. "We've been at odds with Suleiman for years, mostly on the 15-round issue. So I'm not surprised that they tried to pull something like this. We're not going to sit by and let them try to railroad the fight, though." The dispute was aired at a closed-door meeting, and Nevada Commission Chairman Sig Rogich agreed to replace Ortega. The replacement, according to Aram, was supposed to be the Texan Dickie Cole, but by fight time they chose California's Dick Young. Not for the last time, the Petronellis apparently outsmarted themselves. On the night of the fight, Young, the replacement judge, scored both completed rounds for Hearns, and Santos and Gibbs scored for Hagler. Richard Steele, nominated to be the referee, had been at the center of some controversy for the handling of a Michael Dokes Randall Tex Cobb fiasco a few weeks earlier. Steele was a casino executive at the Riviera up the Strip, where Aram's arch-rival Don King also maintained offices, but neither side objected to his presence as the third man in the ring. "It's not only my biggest fight, it's the biggest fight there's ever been," said Steele. "Of course I'm excited, but I'm going to try and approach no differently than if it were another ESPN undercard fight. We have to keep in mind all times is that these are two human beings I have to protect," the referee added. "I want to make sure they can both walk out of the ring when it's over." When it had been announced in December that the fight had been posted at 13-10 with Hagler the favourite, but the punters had quickly bet it down to a 6-5 pick, and as the day approached, the odds fluctuated between one man and the other. 5 days before the bout, a big influx of Motown money had temporarily made Hearns the favourite. Convinced in his own mind that gambling interests had been behind his disputed 1979 draw with Vito Antuofermo, Marvin Hagler was almost phobic about betting odds. But one day he overheard somebody say that Hearns had got a nose in front at the sportsbook that morning and was narrowly favoured. "See," exclaimed Hagler, "the pressure is on Tommy Hearns, not me. A lot of people are looking at our fights against Durant and figuring he can beat me. And I'm just hoping he's fool enough to believe them, because he's going to find his ass on the deck." "I'm glad you told me that," Marvin said with a grin. "I hope Las Vegas makes him count to 10. And Amanta Reese, the sportsbook director at Caesars, predicted that Hagler Hearns would be the most heavily bet fight in Las Vegas history and could approach the record set by the Super Bowl a few months earlier. On the Thursday night before the big fight, ESPN celebrated the 5th anniversary of its top-ranked series with a card at the Showboat. Terrence Ali, who was to have fought Choo Choo Brown, pulled out on the evening of the fight, citing illness, thus promoting the Brett Summers-Chris Calvin co-feature to main event status. Summers, a young lightweight trained by Stewart, was unbeaten at 22-0, while Calvin was 15-3-2, was a well-travelled Nashville fireman who had battled Hagler's stablemate Eddie Curette to a draw at the Boston Garden 2 years earlier. Calvin, the self-proclaimed Southern rebel, jumped right on Summers, pummeling him all over the ring in the first. He appeared to have won the fight in the third when he knocked Summers down 3 times. for what should have been an automatic 3-knockdown rule stoppage, but Joey Curtis bewilderingly ruled one of the knockdowns a slip. Joey may be a lousy referee, but he saved the show, Al Bernstein would say later. Just a couple of years earlier, Curtis had suspiciously waved off Michael Doak's fight against Mike Weaver after just 63 seconds. Summers was down 9 times in all before Curtis stopped the fight in the 10th. The Kronk boxing team, which by then included at least 30 professionals, had been out in force for the Calvin Summers fight, and they filed out of the arena disappointed with the result. The rest of us would later shudder at the thought of what might have been had Joey Curtis and not Richard Steele had been assigned to work Hagler Hearns a few nights later. Once the principals arrived in Vegas, Hearns had halted his sparring on Tuesday, 6 days before the fight, while Hagler engaged to a closed-circuit workout with Watts and Holly across town at Johnny Toko's ringside gym. "After Palm Springs," said Hagler, "I need to get used to the smell of a gym again." Hagler said the reasoning for working out privately was not a cloak and dagger decision. It's that we're all about business. We're taking this serious.